All right, in lecture 6, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, and I believe we had talked briefly, or I talked briefly about the Atlantic Charter, August 1941 in Newfoundland. And this is, again, to remind you, and I think this is critically important, that Roosevelt is going to meet with Prime Minister English Churchill. You see both men seated in the picture, and they agree to what is now known as the Atlantic Charter, and you see a copy of it there. We will read this in some detail to look for President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points from the end of World War I. And this is, again, I think, a very idealistic vision of the world that the United States is going to promote and fight for. And I think it really gives us grounds for, when the United States enters into the war, what we are trying to achieve. And I think that much of U.S. intervention and many of the future wars the United States fought in the 20th century can find their roots in the ideas and principles laid out in the Atlantic Charter. So that's why I wanted to go back and just quickly touch on that again. But moving forward, we're going to continue with our story and the march towards World War II. And what we're going to look at here is an incident that involved the United States destroyer, the USS Greer, that you see pictured there. And what was happening was that U.S. destroyers were patrolling the waters of the Atlantic, and in particular the North Atlantic, the coast of Greenland, the coast of Iceland, and these are areas that Roosevelt had sort of, using his executive powers, had claimed as American territories, American waters almost, so that we are defending these waters. Now, if anybody knows anything about the Atlantic Ocean and the geography, Greenland and Iceland are fairly far removed from the United States. They're not United States territories or possessions like Puerto Rico or Guam. So Roosevelt's claim is sort of interesting. Did he have the authority as president, as commander-in-chief, to extend U.S. territorial waters to Greenland and Iceland? And I think that's kind of no, I'm not sure he did, but that's something that he does. And the Germans, of course, had their U-boat fleets in those waters, trying to intercept convoys of British ships in particular. And remember that the British were purchasing arms from the United States at first on the cash and carry basis, and then once Lend-Lease goes through, the United States is providing those arms to Great Britain, yet they're still being carried on British ships. So the Germans understand this, and they're trying to intercept the flow of goods to Britain by sinking these ships. And the United States has its naval fleet, primarily destroyers, patrolling these waters as well. And what happened in this instance, there was an incident where the USS Greer was shadowing a German sub and radioing coordinates of that German sub back to British ships that would then try to attack and sink the sub. And so the German sub attacked the USS Greer. And this was the first time that you had a German sub attacking a U.S. destroyer, and this is going to escalate in the coming months. And remember, this is 1941, and we see that though the United States is not at war, Roosevelt is going to, in October of 1941, order that U.S. merchant ships can carry provisions and goods to England now, to the British, and that U.S. destroyers will escort those British ships. So what Roosevelt has done is essentially nullified the neutrality laws, and Congress backed him on this. So by October 1941, there is a change, again, in policy, not only from Lend-Lease now, but now you have U.S. ships carrying goods to England, and you have protection provided by the U.S. Navy. And what was going to happen was what is called an undeclared shooting war between German subs that are still intent on stopping the flow of goods to England. So German subs are going to be targeting both U.S. merchant ships and U.S. naval ships. And this is really kind of an undeclared war, though it is not war at this point. And I think what the interesting thing here is, and I say here on the slide, that Roosevelt hid the truth. Roosevelt never came clean with the American public that U.S. destroyers were shadowing German subs, that is, following them and reporting their coordinates to British ships. I mean, this is a highly provocative thing to do, and it's a dangerous thing to do. Roosevelt never came clean with the American public. So, in a sense, this Greer incident where a German sub did fire torpedoes on a U.S. ship was something that you might think, or you might claim, that the United States instigated. And that Roosevelt was sort of looking for a way into the war by putting U.S. ships in these positions in these waters. So a fabricated incident. And again, is the president, in this case Roosevelt, using his powers according to the Constitution? And that is, he's the commander-in-chief. He cannot declare wars. And that's kind of an interesting question that we will see throughout the rest of our course in future wars. So, moving forward, I already mentioned that there was the repeal of the neutrality law. I already mentioned that U.S. merchant ships are carrying arms under escort, and I already mentioned that the presidential powers, did Roosevelt really stretch them? And in doing so, does he set a precedent? That is, does he create a model for other presidents? Eisenhower, Johnson, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, to use presidential powers in ways that involve the United States in conflicts abroad. And that's a big, big, thorny question, but it's one I think we need to look at as we study U.S. history in the 20th century and the 21st century. So, what was U.S. public opinion at this point? And again, we're in the fall of 1941, so September, October, November. We see clearly that the American people sympathize with Britain and France. Nobody is really actively, openly supporting Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, or Benito Mussolini and the Fascist Party in Italy. So there's clear sympathy and support for the British. Yet, and this is a big yet, the American people do not want troops being sent to Europe. And again, the question that I wrote down there at the bottom, why is it that Americans do not want to send troops to Europe at this point? So public opinion in support of Britain and France against the Nazi and fascist powers, but we don't want to have U.S. troops on the ground. And that's a question that I think you might be able to answer. So we'll take that up in class. If you can stop the lecture and jot down an answer to that question, bring it to class. All right. So let's get to the war. I mean, we've been doing, this is the 6th lecture after all, building up to the war. So I think it's now time to move to that moment in this story and in history when war comes to the United States. And I write up at the top there, not Germany, but Japan. And despite all the things that Hitler and the Nazis had done in the 1930s, their expansion, their militarization, their persecution of Jews, all of this was known to the American people by and large. Yet it's not Germany, but it's Japan that gets the United States into what we now call the Second World War. And that's kind of interesting because you think about Japan. Where is Japan? Well, it's in the Pacific Ocean. You see the map. It's Southeast Asia. And that is very far away from the United States, of course, and it's also very far away from Europe. So what was going on in Southeast Asia was something that we have talked about. Japan in 1931 had launched an invasion of Manchuria, which you see pictured here. Japan was then going to expand farther south in an attempt to find natural resources to fuel its military industrial machine. Rubber, petroleum in particular, were things that they were finding in the Dutch East Indies and in British Malaya. So you might wonder, well, what's the linkage, or how is it that Japan gets mixed up with Europe? And you might remember that there were the tripartite alliances. So you had Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all allied. Now, we all know that war officially came to the United States with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, Hawaii is not in this map. That's why I drew that blue arrow with the Hawaii. So Hawaii is just off this map. And that's where this first attack and a sneak attack occurred on December 7th, 1941. So I think that is a date that we might be aware of. We might remember December 7th, 1941. And what we want to look at is the idea, and before we get to that, was the United States throughout the 1930s had been opposing Japanese expansion and aggression in China, in Southeast Asia. The United States, if you remember, wanted to follow and practice the open door policy, that is, the open movement of goods, of money, and people through regions to produce greater prosperity, but also peace. So the United States and the open door, prosperity and peace, had been what we had practiced throughout the 1930s. Now, at some point, however, Japan really began to push its military expansion, and it was using in large part, and here's what you need to pay attention to, it was using in large part American resources. The Japanese don't have much petroleum, they don't have much steel, they didn't have a large steel industry, so they're buying petroleum and steel by and large from the United States and shipping it to Japan and using that to build their large army, their air force, and their naval forces. So what the United States began to realize is, by about 1940, that diplomacy and this idea of the open door wasn't really working, so the United States begins to implement and practice what is known as economic embargoes. And so we're going to try to cut off the supply of goods to Japan. And that's something that we do in terms of not a full embargo, but by 1940-41, President Roosevelt is going to order a partial embargo. And then he's going to say that any sales, any Japanese purchases in the United States have to be approved by the government. And if the government of the United States says, we do not approve of the sale of these goods because we feel that they will be used for the Japanese military war machine, then they're not going to be sold. So that's something that the United States is going to do in 1940-41, in particular 1941, in particular the fall of 1941. And at some point, the Japanese reacted very angrily, and they were very embittered by this move on the part of the United States. And really what the Japanese then did was they only redoubled their efforts to increase their territorial holdings in Southeast Asia. And they were really interested in the Dutch East Indies, that you see it all the way down there by Australia, because of oil. And that's what they really needed, and the United States was denying oil. Another thing that Japan did in 1940, September, was they signed what is known as the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. And in the terms of this pact, the three nations, Japan, Italy, and Germany, carved up the world into spheres of influence. And that if any of these three nations came under attack, the other two would come to their aid. So this is a defensive treaty. And it's important to remember that. It's a defensive, not an offensive treaty. So at this point in the story, we already talked about the fact that Japan is continuing to push its expansion, to grow its empire, looking for those resources. The United States is responding by trying to cut off or limit trade of key resources, and that led to this, the surprise air attack. At some point, the Japanese military leadership decided that in order to protect its fleet and its possessions in this very vast area that you see in this map, that the only thing it could do was launch a preemptive, that is, surprise attack on American forces at Honolulu in Pearl Harbor. And this is where the United States naval base was, and the U.S. Western or Pacific Fleet was stationed. And the goal of the Japanese was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and therefore protect the Japanese Navy and its Southeast Asia possessions. Now, of course, we understand from history that this is what we might call today a short-sighted or foolish decision, though the Japanese military planners then didn't see it that way, although there is one of the Japanese admirals, Yamamoto, I believe, or Nomura, I have to check the names, who said, look, this might not be the best thing to do, because if we awaken the sleeping giant, Japan really has no chance of winning a war. Yet back to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It took place, as you know, on December 7th, 1941, early in the morning, 8 a.m. Local time. It resulted in 2,300 deaths, thereabouts. It resulted in the loss of several large battleships, destroyers, and just about all the airplanes that were stationed in Hawaii. The one saving grace for the United States was that the fleet of U.S. aircraft carriers was out at sea on maneuvers. They were not then destroyed. President Roosevelt is going to claim that this is a day that will live in infamy, and you can see that President Roosevelt addressed the Congress on December 8th, 1941, the day after, and Congress is going to declare war And the interesting thing is, Hitler then declares war on the United States on December 10th. We'll end there. Thank you.